Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the past 2 weeks, I've twice asked the government why there is still a 35% tariff on Russian fertilizer when it is clear that this is not causing a net decline in Russian exports nor a fall in the price paid worldwide for Russian product. The purpose of the tariff, when it was imposed in the spring of 2022, was to punish Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. That year, a total of $115 million in tariff revenue was collected on fertilizer and fertilizer precursors. But because the contracts with Russian suppliers had already been signed and the fertilizer had already been loaded onto ships, the cost ended up being borne not by the Russians, but by the Canadian farmers who were on the hook for these purchases. This debacle prompted one contemporary analyst to observe in December of 2022, quote, "Sanctions should be punitive, but for tariffs on fertilizers, there is no evidence that Russian companies are affected at all," end quote. By the start of 2023, Canadian agricultural organizations were calling for the tariff to be lifted, pointing out that Canada was alone among G7 nations in imposing tariffs on Russian fertilizer. Now, I don't see any evidence that our farmers are any less supportive of Ukraine than the rest of Canadians, but I think they wondered quite reasonably why in this country, unlike the rest of the world, farmers were being singled out to pay a vastly disproportionate share of the financial burden for supporting Ukraine. Since 2023, direct Canadian imports of Russian fertilizer and fertilizer precursors like urea have largely dried up. But this has not had the hoped-for effect of driving down the total worldwide demand for Russian urea or monoammonium phosphate. Here's what has happened instead. Canada now imports about 50% of its urea and about 60 to 70% of its monoammonium phosphate from the United States, up significantly from 4 years ago. Meantime, the U.S. has increased its own direct imports from Russia, making up the demand shortfall. A position paper prepared earlier this year by the Grain Farmers of Ontario reports as follows on the implications of what I've just described. Quote, "Granular, fertilizer-grade urea is an indifferentiable commodity, meaning individual tons are very difficult, if not effectively impossible, to trace. The vast majority of U.S. urea exports to Canada enter our country through inland border crossings, but that doesn't mean the urea received can't be a blend of Russian tons with domestically produced American tons," end quote. The report goes on to observe that even when Russian product isn't being transited to Canada via the USA, the need to import from our southern neighbors hurts Canadian farmers and enriches American middlemen without actually reducing the net North American demand for Russian product. And I quote again, "American companies are essentially able to benefit from both sides, importing cheap Russian urea and exporting expensive American urea. The Canadian farmer ends up being the one to foot the bill," end quote. So, if the foregoing is correct, why on earth are we retaining the tariff on Russian fertilizer and fertilizer precursors? Surely Canadian farmers don't need to be further impoverished by a completely ineffective policy that doesn't make any difference at all to Russia or to Ukraine.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the member opposite, the member from Lanark Frontenac, who have had many good discussions with in other committees that we served on together for some time. I would like to start by reiterating our government's total support and commitment for Ukraine, a cause for which, unfortunately, my Conservative colleagues across the way have chosen not to support. I watched them stand up in this House and vote against the interests of Ukraine on numerous occasions, which shocked and surprised me. Perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise today that they seem to want to reverse course on essentially sanctions and tariffs towards Russia. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, supported by Belarus, is a violation of international law and threat to the rules-based international order. Our government understands that Ukraine is once again at the front line of the struggle for democracy and freedom, and at this critical time, Canada continues to be a steadfast ally in Ukraine's relentless pursuit of freedom. I remember getting to meet President Zelensky and actually shaking his hand, and I iterated to him that we would never stand down, that we would always be there to support Ukraine. And it's unfortunate that I watched as my Conservative colleagues had a change of heart in this House of Commons in the past Parliament. Just last week, our colleague, the Minister of Finance and National Revenue, chaired a virtual meeting during which G7 finance ministers agreed to bolster coordinated measures to increase pressure on Russia to end its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. And I'm proud to say that since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Canada has committed nearly $22 billion in multifaceted assistance for Ukraine, including over $12.4 billion in direct financial support. That, Mr. Speaker, is the largest per capita direct financial contribution among G7 countries. This is one of the ways we are supporting Ukraine in its ongoing efforts to defend itself from Russia. Canada took immediate action to ensure that countries that violate the rules-based international order cannot economically benefit from it. That's why, Mr. Speaker, in March of 2022, Canada withdrew on a temporary basis the most favored nation status for tariff treatment of imports from Russia and Belarus. Since that time, the general tariff of 35% has applied on virtually all imports from these countries, and the government moved forward to make this change permanent as announced in Budget 2023 and enacted in June of 2023. This permanent withdrawal reflects the enduring nature of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine with support from Belarus. It is important for the Government of Canada to send a signal to Canadian importers to incentivize sourcing away from these two countries. To reiterate, the general tariff of 35% continues to apply to virtually all imports from Russia and Belarus, including for imports of fertilizers. As such, Mr. Speaker, I would like to note that there have been no commercial imports of Russian fertilizer since June of 2022. That, to me, speaks of the effectiveness of this measure. This means that Canadian importers have indeed moved away from Russia to alternative sources of supply. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lanark-Frontenac.
Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague has no specialized expertise in agriculture and is reading pre-prepared remarks which ignore everything that I just said about how Russian supply still comes via the U.S., an upcharge occurs, no demand for Russian worldwide demand, North American demand remains the same, prices remain high. This is a completely futile policy. I just want to take a moment, though, to make another point. I am so sick of hearing these self-righteous liberals talking about what great things they've done for Ukraine and lecturing conservatives about how we are not supportive of Ukraine. You know, Mr. Speaker, shortly after the invasion, my family took in a family of 6 Ukrainians from Dnipro in the eastern part of the country, and they were our friends and stayed with us for a year and a half. On the day I raised my question, we had their nephew and niece staying in my house. I had coffee with them that morning. I wouldn't betray my friends. I wonder if this member or any of his colleagues took in a Ukrainian family. I sincerely doubt it. They're full of hypocrisy. They do not help Ukrainians any more than anybody else, and they should not engage in hollow rhetoric to that effect.
The honourable parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't consider it hollow rhetoric when I watched in the last Parliament the Conservative Party take a turn where this House stood together on supporting Ukraine over and over and over again for months, and then all of a sudden, shortly after the new leader of the opposition took power, that there was a change in tone, there was a change. We watched the Conservative Party stand up and vote against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. We watched them vote against more support for Operation Unifier. And again, I watched them at least 4 or 5 times that I can remember. And I was embarrassed to watch that, I have to say. So good on the member opposite for supporting a Ukrainian family that was displaced as a result of the war. But don't lecture me on who stands up for Ukraine, because we have stood steadfast behind Ukraine from day one and will continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.